Thank you very much for inviting me here and being able to participate in this marvellous week. Now, as it turns out, I decided to begin looking at some topics to do with Indigenous people. I wasn't actually even anticipating that very moving welcome that we've already just experienced, so it's quite a bit of synchronicity that I've actually can take off on that particular point. And with your permission, rather than moving into the stratospheric realms of intellectual abstraction, I thought I'd tell you a bit about my own story, not in any sort of egotistical way, but just so that you know for the next, 3 days, where I'm actually coming from, as my students put it. Where are you coming from? And so this is sort of semi-autobiographical, and I've called it Aboriginal Cosmology and Spiritual Renewal. And we've heard some of the Maori position today, and I want to match that with the Indigenous people of my land. Australians and New Zealanders are close in some ways, neighbours across the ditch, as the saying has it. We share the Anzac tradition, which is the real bond, and coming up, of course, is the 100-year anniversary of the Gallipoli catastrophe. But there are significant differences too between Australia and New Zealand, and I do want to acknowledge these and not gloss over them. The main difference is that the Maori are a warrior people and Aboriginal people are not. And as you know, the Maori put up formidable resistance to the European invasion of their land, whereas Aboriginal people responded in very different ways and were in fact overrun by the British. Thus, in New Zealand, there's ample evidence of a Maori renaissance, and a continuing one at that, whereas in Australia there is no Indigenous renaissance, tragically. Maori language carries culture and force in New Zealand, whereas most Australians, as in European Australians, would not even know one word of Aboriginal and aren't interested to learn either. So in this sense, the countries are strikingly different. And I would suggest that probably New Zealand and Canada lead the way in global awareness of what it means to be a post-colonial country, and that Australia, alas, is languishing far behind. I was born in Melbourne, a city which is like a second-hand London, and when I was 12, my family was forced to move to Alice Springs, which is the very centre of Australia. It was not just a move interstate, as people would say today. It was like an emigration to a new world. We moved to Alice Springs because family members were suffering from asthma, and doctors advised that a change to a desert climate would enable us to regain our health. The recovery did happen, somewhat miraculously, in a matter of weeks. I arrived in Alice Springs as a devout Christian, following in the footsteps of my parents and grandparents who were dedicated to the church. My relationship to my natal faith, however, was very much complicated by my encounter with Indigenous cultures. One always has to speak in the plural about Aboriginal cultures, as there is not one but many. For instance, if we're talking about language, there are 250 Aboriginal languages and over 600 dialects of Aboriginal language in Australia, whereas I believe, although you could correct me, in Maori culture there's one language, which makes it a lot easier to represent the Maori people and also to be united among themselves, and also to be able to speak to European powers and authorities. This was always lacking in the Australian context. Now, to modern people, the old is often frowned on and seen as burdensome. The old way of doing things is often associated with convention and lack of spontaneity, but the very old, the primeval, that which speaks of ancient times, is often the source of renewal in modern culture. This was certainly the case when I encountered Central Australia, both its landscape, which is among the oldest geological formations in the world, and its indigenous people, who were described by former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd as the oldest continuing cultures in human history. As you'll see from the overhead, that was part of his official and very belated apology to Indigenous people in 2008. We have no equivalent to the Treaty of Waitangi, which is really a huge absence and a huge loss. Here in this country you have the Treaty of Waitangi, which served as a legal and political and moral benchmark for a whole lot of negotiations and a great deal of social justice that in Australia we did not have. When I lived in the presence of this ancient Central Australian land and people, something primordial stirred in me. Contact with the ancient seems to bring out the deepest parts of the human soul in ways which are in fact difficult to explain. Now, spirit and soul are terms that my academic colleagues would regard as totally obsolete, things of the past, dinosaurs, as they'd say. But these are aspects of personality which awoke in me in Central Australia when I arrived there in the early 1960s. Now, the age of 12 is when I set foot in Central Australia. It's actually a very good age to experience something big, because it's the traditional age, 12 and 13, of initiation, where a person moves out of childhood into the beginnings of adulthood. The traditional custodians of the Central Deserts are the Aranda people, but today there's a mix of Indigenous groups, including Pitjantjatjara, Pintupi and Warlpiri. And to this day, I actually swear in those languages so that no one understands what I'm saying. And I can swear in Pitjantjatjara, in Pintupi and in Warlpiri with a bit of Aranda thrown in. So it's very handy, because almost no one in my city of Melbourne knows these languages. Alice Springs is known as Mapatwa to the traditional inhabitants, and the McDonald Ranges, which are so often seen, are called the Atharia Hills. Everything in this place has at least two names, and I've been interested in wandering around New Zealand how buildings and places and townships all have two names. And we in Australia have this too, one given by Europeans who bequeathed the names of pioneers and kings and princes to everything they saw, and another given by the Indigenous who named places and landscapes according to the ancestral spirits of their religions. The site of the town is part of the Yeperenyi, or caterpillar dreaming, and it's believed that the ranges, which have a wave-like formation, are the streams of caterpillars coming in to Mapatwa to dance and perform the ceremonies that created the landscape of Alice Springs. The western side of Alice, where I lived, is part of the wild dog dreaming, and Heavitree Gap, Natarapi, was a place where men's sacred objects were stored. Now, all this powerful reality was kept out of white Australian consciousness and suppressed. It was evident as soon as I arrived that I was expected not to participate in this Indigenous reality with, as I said, different place names for everything. The Christians were, let us say, anything other than Christian in this regard, if by that term we mean operating in the spirit of Christ, which is the spirit of openness, acceptance and inclusiveness. There was a so-called colour bar, dreadful term, but it was well used in the 1960s, in operation between whites and blacks. And my society made it clear I was not to cross the bar. White or our European Australians were quick to denounce, at the time, South Africans for their apartheid policies and institutionalised racism. But as a young teenager, I couldn't see any difference, really, between South Africa, which we were meant to hate, and the Society of Central Australia, which we were supposed to love. We were projecting our evil upon Africa and not seeing the evil in ourselves. And that Christ, the great psychologist, talks about the mote and the beam in our eyes, etc. This is, of course, Matthew 7, verses 3 to 5. And that always used to come up. We loved to hate South Africa and didn't see that we were the South Africa of the Southern Pacific. Now, despite the colour bar and racial taboo, no one who was sensitive to place could help but be influenced by the ancient cultures that had been connected to this land for more than 40,000 years. The place was imbued with the Aboriginal spirit, and it far outweighed, of course, the influence of white culture. To connect with the land was to connect with Aboriginal spirit. The two had become interchangeable. In Melbourne and Sydney and Adelaide and these sorts of cities, landscape doesn't really loom large. It is at most a backdrop to human affairs and nothing more. The closest people got to nature in Melbourne was complaining about the weather. And we do that a lot in our city. In Alice Springs, landscape moved from background to foreground. It's the dominant force, far more impressive than the town itself, which seems quite fragile and inconsequential against the background of this ancient, very sacred land. It was not only the visual impact of the land that impressed me, but something deeper. The land began to speak to me in ways that I had not anticipated and in ways I was not prepared for. This crept up on me and was something I intuited. It excited me, and yet it seemed to precede language. Certainly no one in the town ever spoke about the impact of the land on their consciousness. I became receptive to something ancient, eternal, and wise in the place. The land opened me to a dimension of reality that my own white culture never spoke about. We would, of course, speak in aesthetic terms about the land, the beauty of the canyons and gorges, the contours and colours and shades of rocks, the valleys and the plains. But this was not half of what I was experiencing. I did not have a language for it at the time, but there was something spiritual going on, and I only found language for it much later. The land spoke to something ancient and eternal in myself. I was barely a teenager, but there was something awakening in me that had nothing to do with youth as such, but was more the province of age and wisdom. And under the influence of the intense heat of the centre and the erosion, rocks in the central deserts often shed their outer surface, revealing their inner core. This is called exfoliation in geology, and it seemed to be happening to me at a psychological or emotional level. I seemed to be losing a layer that I'd brought up from Melbourne, and in the Central Australia, that layer seemed to be falling off. This not only happened to me, but to other members of my family. It occurred to my mother, for instance, who began to paint the landscape using oils and acrylics. She'd never shown the slightest inclination to artistic activity in Melbourne. My father too felt his life change, and while he was less articulate than my mother about matters of the spirit, he did respond to the land in ways that were transformative. For instance, he used to speak about the deafening silence of the place, particularly at night, and one of his favourite terms was the rugged beauty of Central Australia and its impact of colour, of purples and reds and bright blue sky. We'd moved to Central Australia for my sister, whose asthma was so relentless that one lung had already collapsed in Melbourne, and yet she seemed to come to new life in Alice Springs. She changed from a sickly patient in St Vincent's Hospital to a blossoming beauty in the desert. I became almost intoxicated by the land and wanted to spend more time in it. I joined the Alice Springs Gem and Mineral Club, which went out on field trips exploring the rocky landscape and finding gemstones and mineral formations. It was more than a scientific expedition or a geological hobby. I felt it as a form of reverence or contemplation of natural forces and formations. And at high school, geography rapidly became my favourite subject, and I began to sense eternal forces at work in the land. Now, it took me several years to make connections with Aboriginal cultures. I had, of course, plenty of Aboriginal friends at school. More than half the school was Aboriginal. But we didn't dare talk about these sensitive matters. Somehow they were just too sensitive. All that was personal and cultural at that level remained unspoken. But by the time I was 16, I was having conversations with Aboriginal elders about land or country, as they call it, country. We'll come and show you our country, they say. And they don't mean that in the European sense, they mean it in the Indigenous sense. Some Indigenous people I met said I had begun to, quote, think like a blackfella. When I said that in America last year, they thought that was terribly insensitive. But I said, no, this is the term coming from Aboriginal people, not my term. So I had to make that very clear. And I'd begun to think like a blackfella. That means you're a good fella. It means they can relate to you. That was their language. And by this phrase, they meant I could feel the aliveness of the place and the ancient forces moving within it. Now, in those days, Alice used to be called the dead heart or dead centre of Australia because there'd been a long and desiccating drought and there was little green around and the cattle industry was dying off. But paradoxically, it was this apparently dead place that I could feel and others could feel the living forces of the land. As has often been said, quote, from time immemorial, the place of spiritual transformation has been the desert. So to use a theological term, I could feel a sense of presence, such as I could not feel in the city of Melbourne. It was as if the forces of creation were stripped bare and were closer to our awareness than in places where the abundance of rainfall and moisture drapes the bones of nature with layers of green life and loamy soil. Ironically, when the living flesh of nature is cut back, the bones begin to dance a dead man's dance. This is far more than aesthetic matter, but an awareness of an interior life that is disguised or hidden in greener places. Now, the Holy Lands of Israel and Palestine were desert places, of course, and I began to feel that the injunction, take off your shoes, for the place on which you stand in holy ground is holy ground, could relate to our ground as well. It was not until my gap year, 1971, that I began to realise that Aboriginal religions, which I'd not been taught but had, as it were, picked up from the place, were based on responses to the spiritual forces of land. They referred to their religion, of course, as the dreaming, or at least that is a white anthropological term. Al-Chiringa, it's called, in Aranda, and Chirkupa in Piranjara, Pintubi, Warlpiri, and the languages of the Western deserts. Now, what's interesting is that Aboriginal people do not like their religion called, as lots of white people unfortunately call it, the dream time. as that suggests that the time of the sacred was back in the distant past. For them, dreaming is preferred to dream time because it suggests that the sacred is past, present and future, every when, as translated by the anthropologist Bill Stanner. Now, in Christianity, I think we have an equivalent to that in the Gloria Patria, which is as it was in the beginning, is now and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. And I often used to think about that. It was, in a way, my bridge to Aboriginal culture. That was the bridge that I found very, very helpful. Now, the dreaming refers to the presence and interaction of ancestral forces in creation. And the Indigenous relate to these forces and spirits as if they are real, whereas whitefellas can only talk about them by using such terms as fantasy or imagination, terms which are in fact quite derogatory and reductive. Now, so it was a pleasant shock to me to discover that here was an ancient culture whose entire religion was based on the forces of land, which I had only intuited as a young adult. My culture didn't seem to have a religious understanding of the deeper side of nature, but it did at least have art and music and painting and an artistic expression of landscape, particularly poetry. At the time, my connection to Christianity began to thin out a bit because I couldn't find much in Christianity that spoke to my experience. And this is when I began a typically adolescent drift away from the church, which seemed to be operating to me on a different level. Now, I'm speaking here of the early 1960s, before the advent of eco-theology, environmental spirituality, eco-psychology, and all these important new areas and traditions. In other words, this was before the greening of Christianity by eco-theologians and before feminist theologians championed the procreative forces of nature using religious language. Christianity seemed to me in Central Australia a very imported religion, very European, not responsive to the presence of spirit in my country. There were ancient traditions of nature mysticism, of course, in Christianity, such as Celtic spirituality and the nature mysticism of Francis of Assisi, just to name two. But these were not available to me as a young man. Christianity seemed to be very anthropocentric and theocentric, and it didn't speak to what was stirring in my soul. So at the time I felt I was caught between two cultures, but couldn't fully embrace either. I responded with interest to the Aboriginal dreaming, also referred to as the songlines and ancestral spirits, but I knew in my heart that I couldn't take on this religion as it was not my own. I did not yet have the language for this, as I said before, such as, for instance, the colonisation of Indigenous culture, or that phrase often used now by the media and in universities, the appropriation of intellectual and spiritual property. You know, these were terms I learnt many, many years later. But I had an intuition very early that I could not trespass on the spiritual property of another culture. It didn't feel right. I could take an interest in the dreaming and be inspired by it, but it would never become my own. And I knew I had a different task, which gradually began to formulate in me, which was to find something new in myself and find something ancient and buried in my Christian culture that actually answered to this. And that's what I've been doing, really. This is one of the big things I've been doing for decades now, trying to bring up in Christianity this reverence for nature, this reverence, this very Franciscan reverence for earth, which is so old it's now new again. You know, it's so ancient, we've forgotten it. And now bringing it back to awareness, it's as if it's new. I went to Flinders University in Adelaide to do my first university degree, and with a determination to find out what had moved me and what had moved my soul in Central Australia. Not surprisingly, perhaps, I found no answers at all in my university education to this question. And when I began to explain to my lecturers and professors and teachers Aboriginal religion, about which, by the way, they knew nothing, and almost gloriously so, gloriously ignorant of what the original religion of the country itself. My art history teacher said, Aboriginal spirituality, that sounds like what we call in art history the pathetic fallacy, which is meaning to project feelings, as in pathos, onto things which have no animation. My literature tutor described the Aboriginal approach to land as an example of personification, personifying the land. And in philosophy, it was said to be a clear case of anthropomorphism. And in other words, all the subjects that I took, which was philosophy, art history, literature, and education, religion wasn't available to me at that university because it was a so-called enlightened university. And it said that religion is of the past and no longer relevant to the present. This, very huge amount of prejudice. Now, what occurred to me was that all my teachers were reading the Indigenous experience of spiritual life through the lens of a dualistic and very Cartesian logic. In other words, they were always imposing European assumptions on Indigenous reality and viewing that reality through the lens of a disenchanted civilization. For Enlightenment reason, the cosmos is dead, and only the human subject is alive. So if humans perceive anything spiritual in the land, then this is obviously a projection of our own minds and has nothing to do with the landscape itself. Landscape is at best a blank screen upon which we project our own subjectivity. I was so outraged by this, I actually withdrew from that university because somehow I'd taken on that the Aboriginal position, which is very similar to the Maori position too, had integrity, and it should not be just dismissed in this very arrogant and light-hearted way. So I took a year off and just did labouring and unskilled work like that. Then I went back later, and I thought, no, I'm not going to let them deprive me of university education. I'm going to go back and read the books and do well. What I guess I'm saying is that when you go to university, you learn knowledge and you learn facts and you learn increasingly a great deal of data, but you don't learn, unless it's a uniquely religious university, you don't really learn about your own spiritual life and you don't learn about spiritual development. And I learnt far more from Indigenous cultures than I ever did from the professors in the university system about the life of the spirit. And I felt sure that Aboriginal cultures were experiencing something real. They had, as we call it today, a different kind of knowledge, a different epistemology to that espoused by Western Europe. To me, being European descended was a burden, and being a modern Westerner was almost a drag, since it meant I inhabited a cultural space that was spiritually illiterate. My culture was well versed on the psychological life of the human, but when it came to the spiritual in our nature, it actually had little to say. It was the Aboriginal sacred that moved me and that drove me to study nature poetry, landscape painting, mystical literature and contemplative music. In the 1960s, this is the swinging 60s I'm talking about, my generation was starting to respond to what it called cosmic consciousness and the sacredness of land, with a little help from its friends called drugs. And of course, this was very much the case in Alice Springs. It was take these drugs and you'll begin to experience the animation of the land. You know. And I was perhaps a bit old-fashioned, even in those days. I was interested in a non-drug-induced cosmic awareness. And as such, I was out of step, on the one hand, with my Christian church, which at that time wasn't really even able to speak about the spirituality of place, and also out of step with my baby boomer generation, which was getting into drugs and rock and roll big time. But what I discovered, and I found very comforting, I wasn't out of step with the mystical traditions of Christianity, nor with the serious writings that were coming out of my generation's experiences of Indigenous religion, environmental science, and nature philosophy. Now, before I went to university, I had an encounter, a pure chance encounter. This is what's marvellous about Central Australia. You don't sit down and actually make an appointment to see an elder. You bump into them in the bush, in a place, by a riverbed, or in the street. There's a lot of these chance encounters, and it's a beautiful and very heartfelt and transformative part of living in Central Australia. And one day in 1971, during my gap year, after having finished high school, an old man named Owen, this is on the overhead, stopped in the citrus orchard where I was labouring, and he said to me, just out of the blue, "You white fellas are a curious people to us. It seems to us black fellas that you are not initiated." I'd never even heard of the word initiation before. And I suddenly realised how important initiation is to Indigenous cultures, a rite of passage from one state to another. I was being faced with a culture that took sacredness very seriously as a state that needed to be attained by effort and practice. The ordinary ego, as Messiah Eliade calls it, is something to be overcome, whereas my culture tended to indulge the ego and make it an ideal. Now, Owen went on, "You white fellas put a lot of effort into gaining material things to make yourselves happy, but you don't seem to us black fellas to be happy. You are always striving for more. You grasp at things like children, but it doesn't make you happy. For Aboriginal people, the important things are not bought or sold." And a part of me thought, this is Jesus. This is exactly what Jesus was saying in the Gospels. And I'm getting this from somebody who was completely traditional, had had no contact with Christianity at all. And I felt my skin creep. I felt as if, in that moment, it was a very transformative moment. Now, he asked me if my society had ceremonies to break open the childhood state. What a great concept, to break open the childhood state, which he said was a state of grabbing and consumerism and wanting material things. And I asked what he meant. And he said initiation is designed to turn youth into adults, making them responsible by connecting them with spiritual reality. Initiation was an experience that turned one toward the sacred. Now, as Father Lawrence has been discussing in a very beautiful and articulate way in recent days, in the New Testament this is called metanoia. Metanoia. And when I learned a bit of Greek, eventually, and a bit of Latin, I began to wonder why that beautiful word is translated in the rather drab, in a way, English word repentance, because it's bigger than repentance. It literally means to turn your mind around, to turn your life around. And I think maybe, in a sense, when we're reading our scriptures in English, those of us who do read it in English, we're only getting a bit of the richness in the original scriptures. We might best translate that word perhaps as transformation. Now, in the Gospel of Matthew, the first word Jesus says, actually, is metanoia. Of course, he didn't say that because he was speaking in Aramaic, but that's in the Gospel of Matthew. The first word is transformation, change, turn your life around. And I think in this moment with Owen, I felt this. This was happening. I tried to answer him. He said, does your culture have rituals? And I answered from my Catholic and Christian background. And I said, we do have ceremonies of baptism and confirmation, which are designed to help induct us into maturity. Owen looked unconvinced. He shook his head and said, and this really rocked me, by the way, those ceremonies must not work anymore. Otherwise, you people would act different. And I thought, oh my God. This was like meeting a shaman on the way. But although it might sound, what he might say sounds anti-Christian, it's actually the Spirit of Christ. He's saying, where is the metanoia? Where's the complete dynamic turning around of your life? I don't see it in you white fellas. And why isn't it in your culture? This was a very confronting moment for me. An Aboriginal culture that, ironically, my father had told me was immature and infantile, was actually profoundly mature, at least in the spiritual level, and it could quite adequately criticise my culture for its lack of maturity, because he was actually saying we are all like children who haven't had our lives turned around. And so the fact that this sophisticated awareness can be found in these ancient cultures really made me aware that my dad used to, I have to admit, refer to them as primitives. It gives an ironic twist to this whole situation. I became aware that spiritual awareness is universal. It's found in every culture, and no one tradition, especially my own, could not claim to be the absolute carrier of truth. Now, this set me off in a difficult position, because those of you who have had Catholic, or perhaps I'm not too sure about the Anglican situation, one of our sayings in the Catholic Church is there's no salvation outside the church. Now, that's the Catholic Church. It doesn't include Anglicans, let alone Presbyterians and Methodists and all the others. And so here I was with this fellow thinking, he's really shaken a lot of assumptions that I've grown up with. And at that moment I became aware of a certain difference between spirituality and religion. That he had spirituality, whereas I had religion. And I thought, now I must go on a journey and find this. I have to find this dynamic force of metanoia, which he calls initiation, and I must begin to attune myself more closely to the forces of the land. So the conversation with Owen filled me with excitement, but also inexplicable sadness. I knew what he meant. Christianity was not functioning well. The sea of faith, as Matthew Arnold called it, was at ebb tide. It had not managed to hold back the forces of materialism and commercialism. It had not instilled into its members an abiding sense of the sacred. In fact, this sense had seemingly evaporated. It might be present during rituals on Sundays, and I do still feel it is, by the way, but it did not extend to the rest of the week, where you could be as profane as you like. There was something missing. Somehow my religion had lost its soul, its spiritual effectiveness. Not only had the majority of Westerners already abandoned the churches, in fact I was one of the only ones in my peer group who remained connected and kept going to Mass. My friends used to laugh at me actually and say, oh come on, you don't believe in that claptrap, do you? You know? And those who did have a spiritual inclination found their way into Buddhism, which I became subsequently very interested in. And also they found their way into meditation through Buddhism, not through Christianity, because at that stage Father Lawrence and John Mayne weren't around. They certainly weren't in Alice Springs at the time. Leading retreats such as the one we've had this week. So I knew I had to get my soul back, but also the soul of Christianity back. It's a double thing, and I've dedicated my life to this cause. It's a double cause. In his essay, The Dreaming, Sydney anthropologist Bill Stanner writes of meeting an Aboriginal elder while on a field trip in Central Australia. And I thought, I wonder if it was the same one that I met. Because this is what he said, this fellow, who remains unnamed in a book called The Dreaming. You see it at the bottom of the slide. White man got no dreaming, him go another way. White man, him go different, him got road belong himself. Every time I say that, it puts shivers down my spine. We have a dreaming. Why isn't it alive? Where's the soul gone? Where's the metanoia? Where's the energy, the interest, the passion? And this is what Owen had said to me. Stanner said these words were uttered as if the old man were reciting verse. A lot of Aboriginal people, and I know with Maori people as well, when they speak, it's just like they're reciting poetry. There's some beautiful, almost versification happening. And these words filled Stanner, the anthropologist, as they did me, with a deep sadness and a concern for why we in the West seem to have lost our bearings. We had a religion, but it wasn't doing its job, no longer transforming souls or bringing metanoia. People in ancient cultures find it hard to imagine the modern condition in which secularization has killed off the sacred and left us exposed to the world without any cosmology. For ancient traditions, this would be tantamount to spiritual and physical death. To lose the soul is to lose one's life. And here I'm thinking of that beautiful verse in Proverbs, when there is no vision, the people perish. Or in another translation, where there is no vision, the people cast off restraint. But the first translation was from the King James Version. Now, for the ancient traditions, the sacred is the core of our existence. They can't even imagine what it would be like to lose that core. For them, the sacred is not confined to holy shrines or church services on Sunday, or for Jewish people, synagogue on Saturday, but form the very basis of everything that's done. In a sense, there's no ordinary life in ancient cultures, because everything that's ordinary becomes imbued with the sacred and becomes transparent to presence. The modern West divides life into all these categories: religious, political, economic, educational, social, and so on. These divisions are not found in Indigenous cultures, where everything is part of one great fabric of being. Our culture is very broken and divided, and people would often ask me, which discipline are you in? You know, and what is your bag of knowledge? But the sacred permeates everything and is luminous. And yet the West, in its ignorance, invades these ancient lands and destroys the very thing which is needed to keep the Indigenous alive, which is the omniscience of the sacred, respect for the land and respect for ancient cultures. When we set out on this pathway today, we do it as a deliberate spiritual exercise or discipline. But Indigenous cultures were and are naturally contemplative. We have to learn the art of contemplation, but they are naturally contemplative. If by contemplative we mean living a life in which the sacred shines through ordinary things, as Gerard Manley Hopkins put it, everything shines with the grandeur of God. Everything's full of the grandeur of God. It shines like the shining from shook foil. So ironically today we set about to recover a contemplative life in lands such as Australia and New Zealand, in which contemplative traditions have been decimated, unfortunately, by our forebears. The dreadful and tragic irony of consciously cultivating a spiritual life in such lands as New Zealand and Australia cannot be ignored. Dare I suggest that leading an authentic life in countries like Australia and New Zealand cannot be achieved, can never be achieved, without thinking long and hard about Indigenous people, their suffering at the hands of Europeans, and the dangers in which they continue to exist today. But in these new world countries, so-called, the presence of ancient traditions sitting alongside our modern societies serve as educative forces. It makes us aware that we have chosen a spiritless life, and there are other choices that can be made. However, as I've argued, it would be completely inappropriate to adopt a let's go shopping mentality and plunder the spiritual richness of these Indigenous cultures in order to fill what is often called the God-shaped hole in our own lives. These Indigenous cultures have to be respected sincerely, and this means we have to dig deep into ourselves and not appropriate their cultural or spiritual property to fill this God-shaped hole. Now I'm finishing now, but what Owen said didn't depress me ultimately, as it actually acted as an inspiration for my life. My natal faith was not currently working, was not doing its work of transformation, but it occurred to my teenage mind, perhaps it once was working, and perhaps we could recover this power somehow. Owen's remarks made me critical of my religion, but made me realise at the same time that it must have a spiritual core that could be reawakened. The lost soul could be brought back to life if only we knew how. And later I read Walter Brueggemann's book, The Prophetic Imagination, a beautiful book, where he talks about prophetic criticising. And that, to me, what Aboriginal people and perhaps Maori people in this country do. They prophetically criticise our own culture and say, where's the soul in it? Where's the living spirit in it? Owen made me aware that there was a depth in my tradition that could be and had to be reactivated. It was as if a universal spirituality undergirds all traditions, and the different traditions seek this spirituality to recover their universal heart. Now, it's often said that when we learn another language, for instance, I learnt German when I was a young man, and then I also learnt Spanish, although not Portuguese, Leonardo, I don't think I can speak with you, that when you learn your other languages, you become more sensitive to the grammar of your own. And I think this is what happens to those of us living in lands like New Zealand and Australia. When we encounter Indigenous spiritualities, we naturally enough reflect on what is equivalent in our own, such as the Gloria Patria that I mentioned, world without end, Amen. And we start to try and find bridges of connection so that we're not so unfamiliar, so that we don't stand on either side of a gulf which is miles long, looking at Indigenous cultures as if they belong to an ancient past that we cannot connect with. We must connect with them somehow. D.H. Lawrence, the great English novelist, moved to Australia to live in 1921. He's a great genius, Lawrence, of course. And the first thing he said is that I cannot live in this culture because the gap between my English consciousness and the Aboriginal spirit is so vast that I think I would fall into that gap. And as an artist, as a creative writer and poet, he had to feel he could make a connection with that spirit of place. And he kept writing letters to people back in England saying, I feel as if I'm falling into an abyss in this culture. I've got to leave. And a lot of Australian national people, thought, oh, get away, go back home, you whinging pom, if you don't like it here, you can go away, But I'm not a narrow nationalist like that. I think that Lawrence had a good point, which is that you have to build bridges between the Indigenous and the imported cultures, and if you don't build those bridges, you fall into the gap. But Lawrence was a visitor, a tourist, as it were, and he could go. But a lot of people, like those of us who are born and raised in these ancient lands, like I have been, really we have a duty and a responsibility to create bridges of connection between our own tradition and the traditions of the Indigenous. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.